Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel. In this short video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous night. Obviously the most important events are coming from Avdiivka. The Russians continue their offensive operation. As a result of clashes, the Russians managed to develop their positions to capture new territories, new landfills, new tree lines and so on. Yet the Russians haven't established control even over a single city, but it's just the second day of clashes. I have already updated the map and we will discuss every single direction that the Russians have in this area. In the first area we will discuss the southern part of Avdiivka. According to information we have, the Russians were attacking not just in direction of Tonenькая, Sieverne and direction of Бердичи, Stepove. Also the Russians made a very unexpected and powerful attack in direction from Spartak, the city that located on the edge of Donetsk, in direction of Avdiivka itself. And as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt and furthermore to enter Avdiivka from the south and to establish control over the Ukrainian trenches that located on the south of this area in this forest. This was a very powerful attack and very strong and very interesting results of Russian offensive. So basically currently they're trying to dig in deeper, and as soon as they're able to stabilize this area, of course the Russians will try to continue attacking different directions, trying to force the Ukrainians to send some strategical and operational reserves to the south. The Ukrainians during that attack tried to slow down and to pin down the Russians as much as possible as they could, but as we understand they didn't have enough of power, enough of artillery power to slow down the Russians. We got just one video of Ukrainian FPV drone strike against the lonely standalone Russian armored vehicles. So nothing special, of course it's not something big, not such a significant result, but anyway some attempts to slow down the Russians we could see from the Ukrainian side. Now we are moving to the southern direction, probably one of the most interesting, and the Russians continued their offensive operation in direction of Sieverne, and the sources are saying that as a result of clashes in this direction, the Russians managed to get almost get the outskirts of the city. Currently the Russians are trying to attack and to bomb this city from the tree lines, trying to suppress the Ukrainian artillery in fire positions, and soon, probably today, the Russians will make a very powerful attempt to storm the city from at least 3 sides. From this direction we got three videos to be more precise. This is the episode of clashes on the 10th of October. The Ukrainian tank was located on this tree line on fire position, trying to attack the Russian offensive forces, but the Russians sent FPV drone, and as a result of FPV drone bombing, that tank was destroyed. So just a single episode from the 10th of October. So as you can see, according to this video, for some reason the Ukrainians didn't have a real defense line, let's say between Sieverne and Vadiana. So for some reason, maybe there was rotation process, maybe something else, but I expected to see on this line maybe dozens of Ukrainian tanks and trenches and fire positions, but we haven't seen almost anything from this direction. The Ukrainians from their side published also a video how the Russian tank was heading in direction of Sieverne, but as a result of artillery strike or anti-tank missile strike, the tank was damaged, and later the Russian infantry left the tank and started stepping back. This episode also took place somewhere on the 10th of October during the first hours of clashes, and this episode described the Russian offensive operation and another episode of Russian attack against that Ukrainian line where we just discovered the destroyed Ukrainian tank. So the attack took place somewhere in this area, and as a result of that attack that took place probably on the 10th of October, the Russians managed to capture this line and to get right in front of the city by the name of Sieverne. The Ukrainians during the day tried to slow down the Russians by sending their reinforcement from Avdiivka, Lastechkina, and then to the south along the tree line. They were trying to send some reinforcements, some tanks, and so on, but the Russians controlled the situation. The Russians knew the exact configuration of Ukrainian supply roads, of Ukrainian movements, and during the 10th and 11th of October, the Russians were bombing and attacking this territory heavily using FPV drones. On this video, we see how the Ukrainians sent another tank to support the Ukrainian forces in Sieverne, but as a result of FPV drone strike, that tank was destroyed. The Russians continue bombing Avdiivka with FAB 500, trying to slow down the Ukrainians' movements from one side to another. According to sources we have, there are around 15,000 of soldiers in Avdiivka, and of course, when talking about the battle for Avdiivka, it is better to use the local operational reserves by sending to the south, to the east, to the north, but because of the fact that the Russians have 24 hours bombings of the city, it is very difficult to operate with reserves inside the city, and it is much more reliable to use reserves, let's say, from Cheretina or Novokalinova, so somewhere from the north, and to use them, because it's very difficult to move in Avdiivka. Furthermore, we know that the Russians have established control over the main landfill in the vicinity of Krasnogorivka, which also reduced the Ukrainian possibilities and their flexibility in this direction. The Ukrainians did everything they could. For example, on this video, we see how the Ukrainian FPV drone controlled and tried to track and monitor the situation in the vicinity of Vadiana, and at some second the Ukrainian drone discovered Russian convoy of significant number of tanks who were heading in direction of Toninke. Just on this scene we can see 1, 2, 3, up to 5 armored vehicles heading to Sieverne. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and as a result of FPV drone strike, at least one armored vehicle was damaged. Furthermore, the Ukrainians tried to use their artillery systems, everything they have, from South Donetsk direction, from the area of cities like Nitailova. The Ukrainians were trying to attack the Russians, trying to attack their main supply roads, but the Russians controlled the situation in South Donetsk direction as well, and as a result of counter-artillery duels, significant number of Ukrainian armored artillery systems were destroyed. So basically the Ukrainians, I believe that, and I expect that today we're going to receive some updates from the Ministry of Defense regarding the losses of Ukrainian artillery systems, but we see that during the first few days the Ukrainians lost the counter-artillery duels, and that was also the reason why the Russians managed to achieve significant success during the first days of attacks. Of course, the battle is not going to be finished by today or tomorrow. There is still a lot of job to do. Obviously, we are going to see a lot of Ukrainians counterattacks with attempt to unblock Avdiivka, but so let's wait and let's see. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians, they understand that Ukrainians don't have possibility to operate with reserves in Avdiivka, and the only area that Ukrainians can use for concentration of reserves and forces is let's say, everything that located on top of this yellow line. And because of that fact, the Russians also attack this territory with all types of weapons they have. Currently, we have a lot of fire anomalies in this area, which confirms that the Russians are concentrating on the north of Avdiivka, trying not to allow the Ukrainians to concentrate their forces for counterattacks in direction of Berdychi and Stepove. Now we are moving to Berdychi and Stepove and Krasnogorivka area, the northern flank of Avdiivka. Today we had a lot of very interesting geolocations from both sides, either from the Russians and from the Ukrainian one. Today we got, let's call it something like, let's say, 90% of confirmations that the Russians managed to establish control over the landfill, over the terracon that located on the north of Avdiivka in the vicinity of the chemical plant. Today we got the video how the Russians were attacking and storming this area using significant number of armored vehicles. Up to 50 pieces of armored vehicles were heading on the short line to attack Avdiivka from the north. And this is very interesting video because we can make few conclusions based on that video. The first conclusion is that the Ukrainians were not attacking the Russians with artillery. So the Russians feel themselves pretty secure, pretty safe, having this powerful, very long convoy in 50 units, and the Ukrainians couldn't do nothing with this. And this is a very bad sign for the Ukrainians. That means that Ukrainians' artillery was completely suppressed. We got all the same video from another angle when the Russians have already redeployed and they're continuing sending more and more tanks. I can't even imagine the number of tanks and the number of armored vehicles that were involved in that operation, at least for just Terikon, probably up to 50 tanks as we discussed. And as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to suppress the Ukrainian positions on the line, on the railway line between Stepove and Avdiivka, and basically the Russians managed to capture everything that lays below, that lays on top of this red line. Another wave of attack took place in direction Stepove-Berdichi. We haven't received any update, any video confirmation that the Russians managed to capture anything on the Ukrainian side of the railways, just telegram messages from the officers on the ground and soldiers on the ground who confirms that the Russians managed to enter at least the city of Berdichi on the north. And the Russians managed to enter Stepove also from the northeast. So there are some positions inside of the settlements, but only according to the messages. We haven't received even a single geolocated video. The only thing we have is the Russian attempts to attack in this direction, but even according to these geolocations, we have 100% confirmation that the Russians managed to at least to get the railway line. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russian tank was heading in direction of the railways, and that tank was discovered by the Ukrainian forces. And as a result of probably anti-tank missile, the tank was damaged and the Russian infantry started running and regrouping, trying to save their lives and not to be destroyed as a result of secondary fire from the Ukrainian side. Most of the Russian soldiers ran away, but then they stopped, regrouped, and probably continued their offensive operation further. Furthermore, if you take a look at the Russian tank wasn't destroyed. He just lost possibility to move. But as you can see, the tower was moving, so that means that there is still a powerful fire position, at least in this direction. So later we got another video. The Russians managed to bypass the first line between Krasnogorovka and the railways. Then the Russians were moving and operating using just infantry. The Ukrainians were bombing the Russians heavily with all types of weapons they have. At least on this front line they had some artillery forces, but the Russians continued their movements, and at some point we see the Russian landing operation exactly in the area of the railways, in the vicinity of the railways. Let's just one more time try to load the video. The video doesn't work, but the Russians, yes, this is it. So this is geolocated video. As you can see, this is a triangle of 3 lines exactly like this. The Russians managed to get the railways, to land the infantry, and after that the Russians started storming this area using just light infantry under support of tank attack and armored vehicles attacks from the hidden positions. So this video at least confirmed us that as a result of clashes on the 10th and 11th of October, the Russians managed to establish control over the railways between Berdichi, Stepove and Krasnogorovka. So this like 100% control. There is no doubt that the Russians control this territory. The only question and doubts we have about Berdichi and Stepove. The Ukrainians from their side also like concentrated. They came to their minds after the few days of clashes and start publishing the videos of Russian losses. For example, they tried to calculate, they tried to provide the same pictures, the same videos as we saw, as they used to see in the vicinity of Robotyne. If you remember, the Russians after the first few days of clashes started publishing and calculate the Ukrainian losses. On the Ukrainians try to do the same. I'm not sure that every single tank that we can see right now on this picture was destroyed by the Ukrainians, and maybe there are also Ukrainian losses, but the Ukrainians are saying that these are completely Russian losses, and according to the first 2 days of clashes on the 10th and 11th of October, the Russians lost up to 26 armored vehicles. So we'll see whether it's true or not, because if it's true, it's going to be one development of the situation, but if it's fake, it is going to be completely different situation. Now we understand that the current mission for the 12th of October for the Russians is to repel the Ukrainians' counteroffensive that obviously is going to take place in the vicinity of Berdych and Stepove, and to dig in deeper inside the cities. If they are able to do this, then there are going to be no problems to counterattack any Ukrainian counteroffensive. The second Russian objective for today is to establish control over Stepove. This is not a very big village, and they do have possibilities using the all forces they have to enter the city, to capture and to create a first stronghold in this area, and basically this is going to be the beginning of the cauldron. And the third objective obviously is to dig in deeper in the vicinity of on the south of Avdiivka by developing their foothold in this area to the west, to the east, and to the north. If the Russians are able to complete all these three missions, then they're going to be like very successful probably. And the fourth objective for the Russians is to develop their offensive operation from the in the vicinity of coal mine, like landfill, and to attack to Avdiivka and to start offensive operation in direction of the residential area. And as a result of this attack, the Russians need at least to get as close as possible and to maintain this white cloud. If the Russians are able to do this as well, then we can start counting days when Avdiivka falls, obviously. The Ukrainians also bombed some Russian forces in Verkhnitoretskaya, probably as the main Russian logistics center in this offensive operation. They were bombing and trying to discover the Russian ammo depots, and as a result of some strikes, artillery strikes, a few ammo depots were destroyed, which of course will reduce some Russian possibilities, but I believe that the Russians prepared themselves pretty much before that operation, so I don't think they have problems with rounds, with munition and support. Also, the Ukrainians try to support their Ukrainian defensive forces from South Donetsk direction, and the Russians also control this territory. And as a result of two FPV drone strikes, Lancet strikes, the Ukrainians lost at least two artillery systems in the city by the name of Yelizavetovka and Ilinka, that Ukrainians were using to attack the Russian offensive forces on Avdiivka direction. So these are videos show us that the Russians were pretty successful in their counter-artillery duels. And the video from Ilinka, another artillery system that was located or was hidden in the tree line in Ilinka, and as a result of Lancet strike, that artillery system was also destroyed. So the battle for Avdiivka develops much better in Russian favor in comparison with the Ukrainian battle for Robotyne. Now we can compare these two offensive operations, and we see that during the first 2 days the Russians managed to get more benefits in comparison with the Ukrainians' first few days for battle for Robotyne, and the Russians had less losses obviously. But today, another day where we're going to receive more updates. Very interesting video we also got from Kupiansk, Liman from front line, and that video was published by the Ukrainian forces. The results of clashes in Novoyegorovka. The Ukrainians published the video of significant losses of the Russian armored vehicles who were trying to penetrate and storm Novoyegorovka the previous week. The Ukrainians are saying that during the previous 5 days of clashes in the area of Novoyegorovka, the Ukrainians managed to destroy also up to 20 Russian armored vehicles, including 3 T-90 tanks. So very heavy clashes in this area as well. Currently, the Russians haven't managed to penetrate the Ukrainians' defense belt in Novoyegorovka, but as I understand, the Russians are not planning to stop. They will continue because this is also primary direction for the Russian offensive operation. The Russians currently try to use the same tactics as the Ukrainians were using during the first phase of greatest counter-offensive operation. If you remember, the Ukrainians attacked the Russians in Zherebyanki, in Robotyne, in Vremivka tactical bridgehead, in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka. So at least the Ukrainians were using 5 directions, and now the Russians are doing the same. The Russians are using the same 5 or even more directions to attack, with the purpose to stretch the Ukrainian forces and to get success at 2 or 3 or 4 positions or something like this. We got, of course, also more updates, but I will keep them for evening updates. And that's it for today. Then Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.